Sixth grade, welcome to week 4. It's crazy how our weeks are slipping by, right? Although we're not able to be together in person, I just want you to know that I'm thinking of you, and I am so excited to hear of the work that God is doing in each of your lives. Now, I hope all of you had a wonderful Easter. If you feel like you missed out on the daily live Easter broadcast, you just head over to my YouTube. They still should all be listed there. Okay, but today we are going to be jumping back into the story of the Gospel of John. In John 1, we saw some challenging but beautiful theological truth of who Jesus was, right? Jesus is God himself coming to this world. And last week we explored chapters 3 and 4, and we saw that Jesus is the provider at the wedding. We saw he's the cleaner of sinful temple worship. We saw that he's the gracious teacher who explains difficult truth to Nicodemus. And we saw that he is living water, explained to the woman by the well. And this week, we're going to shift gears just a little bit. Instead of exploring what Jesus is, or who he is, we are going to look at how he interacts with the 4 key Jewish feasts. We've talked about these feasts earlier in the year and saw that they were part of everyday Jewish life. And so it is really my prayer this week that we would see Jesus as someone who enters into the normal rhythm of our world as well. In John 5 through 10, we see that Jesus is relevant for every part of our life. To understand the story that we'll be looking at today, we need to dive into the text. So here we go. The story starts off with a feast. Now we don't know what feast that was, but it was a reason for Jesus to go back to Jerusalem. In the book of John, going back to Jerusalem almost always means a conflict with the religious leaders. So today is Jewish Sunday, or as they called it, the Sabbath. And we'll see the reason why Jesus will continue to have trouble with the Pharisees. So Jesus is back in Jerusalem, and he goes to the sheep gate. Let's look at where that was. Quick map of Jerusalem here. The sheep gate would have been located right about here. Now, according to John, we know that there was a special pool there, the pool of Bethesda. This is not the swimming pool kind, but instead it would have been a place for people to get a bath. But nowadays we have bathtubs and showers in our home, but back then people went to public bathhouses. Now I think it's safe to say that that is just as awkward as it sounds, right? And we learned from recent archaeology that there were most likely 2 pools in this place. Probably one was for the rich of Jerusalem who came there for their baths. And then reading our passage in John chapter 5, we see that the other one was most likely used by people that were sick. Now I imagine looking around there at these sick people, you would see the weakest of the weak in Jerusalem. People without limbs, people that were blind, people that smelled. I mean, you get the idea, people that are suffering. But John zooms into one man. We know that he was invalid for 38 years. That's a long, long time not to be able to walk. Jesus asked this man a question. It is a question that was meant for the paralyzed man, but we'll see in a minute it could also be applied to the prideful religious leaders and even our life. And the question can be found in verse 6 of chapter 5, where Jesus says, "Do you want to be healed, or do you want to be well?" Now, some teachers might say there are no dumb questions. Now, we all know that that's not entirely true, right? Dumb questions absolutely exist. This question by Jesus seems to fall into that category. I mean, of course this man wants to be healed, right? In fact, he'll go on to explain to Jesus that the reason why he's at Bethesda at this pool is because he wants to be made well. But here's the deal. The hope that Jesus comes to bring shines the brightest on the backdrop of this man's immense pain. As the paralyzed man takes a minute to look back on really his depressing life filled with darkness, he hears Jesus boldly say in verse 8, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." I love the man's response in verse 9. John records that at once the man gets up, takes up his bed, and walks. What an amazing day it must have been for this man. But here's the catch in this story. The miracle happened on the Jewish Sunday, the Lord's Day, or in their words, the Sabbath. The Sabbath was created by God so that once a week they would have had a rhythm of rest. It was a gift from God to humanity. Now the Pharisees had taken this day of rest and added all of these random rules to that. They had turned the gift of a rest day into an extremely complicated day. Now, no one was allowed to do pretty much anything on the Sabbath, but Jesus had done a miracle. Jesus had broken the Pharisees' ridiculous rules, and Jesus was right now in a lot of trouble with those Pharisees. When they confront Jesus, he points them to the truth that we see all over the book of John. He says in verse 17, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." He says, God is working to do good in this world. I am God, and so I'm working to do good as well. Now, the religious leaders are not a fan of that explanation. In verse 18, John gives us a summary of why the Pharisees are so angry with Jesus, why later on in the book, they will actually murder this innocent teacher. Let's look at verse 18. It says, "This is why the Jews are seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." The question Jesus asked the man, "Do you want to be well?" could also be applied to the religious leaders that were standing there. Jesus had said, "Do you want to be well?" They see Jesus. The religious leaders hear him tell the truth, but they rather be angry. If they believed in who he was, he would heal them from their murderous anger. But they did not want to be well and would continue on the path towards the biggest mistake of their life, crucifying Jesus. That question, "Do you want to be well?" is what Jesus asks us today too. We have the opportunity to step into freedom from the sin or the challenges that are in our world, but what comes first is believing in Jesus, answering yes to that question, "Do you want to be well?"